So, Kodak Retina IIa. This one's in quite nice condition and it belongs to a local bloke. So it's avoided spending weeks flying around the globe. Let's start taking it apart. Main problems, everything's a little bit stiff. Could certainly do with a servicing. Just recover a few things here. That spring, of course, I take great care with that. I do not want that getting damaged. The counter is often a bit sticky with old Retina IIas and IIas, and it's usually just down to the fact that the original lubrication has gone nasty and sticky with age, and a little bit of dust and grit getting into the system. Here you can see the original grease there. Now that's got a funny green tint to it. We all know about green grease. The rewind knob. I'll put something through the fork, spin that off. Now this has got a spacer washer under it. Now that spacer washer would have been used to just lift the height, the rest height of that rewind knob slightly so it didn't scuff on the top cover. I'm going to take this apart because I want the wavy washer out of here to clean that, and just make sure that these pieces are clean before they get reassembled. The top cover. Well, we have one screw at each end of the top cover. These screws are quite short. If you're missing a screw on a Retina IIa or IIa, take great note of how long it is. If you put a screw in here, say from a Retina IIIc camera, it will bind. It'll bind on the film advance, and you'll find that the film advance doesn't work properly, or at the very least it's exceptionally rough and lumpy. Right, so there's our top cover. I'll strip that down and clean that later. That looks pretty good. Pieces from the top. We can lift off the shutter release button, but I haven't lifted the shaft out yet, you'll notice. I've got a collar here and the button. We can lift off the film release button, and that spring I'll reclaim and put carefully to one side. Now I need to check the state of my shutter release, because often there's a spacer washer down in the shutter release and I need to see if it's present, and it is. Okay, so I'm aware that that was there. It means that I will be looking for it and I'll know where to put it back. I'll take the spring off that, take the collar off that, take that shutter release out. And take the collar off here. Now there's a spacer here. Now that spacer, that shim will be important. That will, without that, you may find that the shutter advance lever tends to stick. It doesn't want to return to the rest position, and it all has to do with taking up the play, the vertical play in that film advance shaft. Okay. The rangefinder, held on with 2 screws. The rangefinders aren't keyed to the casting, they're simply held on with 2 screws. There's a significant amount of potential play there, so they could be shifted, you know, backwards and forwards a little bit. Don't expect to take the rangefinder off perfectly adjusted and put it back on and have everything line up nicely, because that just doesn't happen. Here's our rangefinder, and you can see here that it sort of oozes back to the rest position very slowly. In fact, it doesn't even get there. Definitely problems with the rangefinder, and I'll have a quick look through it. It's a little bit hazy, not a bad example. Back to the camera. What have we got here? I'm going to take the rewind off. 3 screws at the top of it that hold this bush in place. You'll see that I tend to use both hands on the screwdriver. I'm holding the screwdriver down firmly in one hand. I use the other hand to twist the screwdriver to break those screws loose. It ensures that the screwdriver doesn't cam out and make a mess. Pop the centre out there and pop this off. It's a bit reluctant to come out. I'll just lift that slightly. That's off. Back to the camera body. I'll cock the shutter by pushing the cocking rack all the way back. So the shutter should now be cocked. Lift this gear off here. Shouldn't be using my tweezers as a lever. It'll get me into trouble. Okay, so that's off. And that is obviously not cocked. Now it is. Okay. I'm going to release the film advance by pushing back on that, letting that thing roll down. Pulling this rack back into the cocked position for the shutter allows me access to the 3 screws that hold this down. 2 plain screws, one at each end here, and one here. Now I need to make sure that that spring is unhooked so that it's not under tension. And then I can remove that screw. That's a shoulder screw. The spring revolves around the shoulder. I'll put that spring carefully to one side. This should come off now. There's our rack, and reclaim the 2 screws. Put that mechanism in there. All this stuff is for the cleaner. Back to the camera. What have we got? Alright, so this cam should come off the top, and it's often stiff on that shaft, that squared shaft, and part of the reason for that is often that the shaft is a little bit twisted. I wasn't seeing any problems with this camera beforehand, so I'm not expecting any on the reassembly. But if the camera had been difficult to cock, I certainly would have been looking closely at that. So that's off. We've reclaimed the spring. That drive dog's off. This can come out, and there's a spring under that which conveniently is popped to the surface where I can see it. It's not the same as the spring that went in there for the rewind for the film release button. It's actually a larger diameter. If you mix them up, you'll find that the film release button will not work, even if you do manage to get the spring stuck down there. Right, so off with this post. That has a spring loosely fixed around it. And here's the ratchet pull and the bush that goes under the ratchet pull. This main drive gear, and you can see the colour of that grease. It's a bad colour. 3 screws hold our film advance together. There's some nasty stuff on here. I don't know whether that's grease. It is grease. It almost looked like it might be grit, but it wasn't. It was grease. So all this grease, you know, it's probably original. It's probably 70 years old. And nothing works quite as good as it used to when you're 70 years old. Okay, so what are we up to now? Everything is pretty much stripped off the top of the camera. Flip it over, start on the bottom. 2 screws hold this surround in place for the tripod socket. Now that tripod socket looks a bit damaged there. It may have been that it's had problems on a tripod. Someone's done something awful to it. It may be that the camera has hit the ground hard right on that spot. And it may well be that this tripod socket surround does not want to come off the camera. Let's recover those screws. They're just chrome plated brass. They're very easily damaged. If I can get this one to lift out. Yeah, it's going to lift out. Right, this surround, will it come up? Yeah, it's going to. That edge there is a bit knocked about, but it's not. It'll work. That's chrome plated brass. That should be fairly robust, so it's had a good thump. The leather. On the base of the camera I need to peel the leather back at least to this far so we can get at one of the screws for the struts, but ideally I want to peel it all the way back to here, so when it goes back down there'll be no obvious crease. If you peel leather back, say to here, and then you glue it back afterwards, you'll always end up with a line at that point, and I'd like to avoid that. So can I get under this leather with my scalpel, and importantly, will it lift easily? That glue is pretty tenacious. Often the glue has gone dry and brittle and cracks away easily. Here I'm sliding my scalpel down underneath it, and I'm trying to keep the blade in firm contact with the metal. In other words, making sure that it gets right down against the metal, that I'm not cutting through layers of leather. You don't want to fillet the top of the leather off and leave the rest of it on the camera. If you can at all avoid it. Resist the temptation to fold that leather right back. If the leather's fairly supple, that won't make any problem at all, but if it's a bit dry and brittle, you'll end up with cracks in it. You could do without that. Round here, of course, it's quite a narrow bit of leather. That means it's vulnerable to damage. If I slide a small screwdriver bit down there to peel it away, that'll be good. Once I'm past these obstructions, I can slide my scalpel in at a more oblique angle. I have a better chance of getting that leather off undamaged. Okay, so I'll lift this leather up gently. We've got 3 screws hold the tripod socket in place. Now, unusually in this case, those screws are nice and tight. That is by no means always the case. And usually you can put that down to people having been somewhat rough with their tripod. We've got 2 screws hold this shield in place around the rewind button. The earliest Retina 1As and 2As didn't have a shield there. That meant that the rewind button is very vulnerable to being accidentally touched, and as a result, you'd end up with the film advance being disconnected. Okay, so far so good. I want that rewind button off ideally. So, getting the rewind button off without making a mess of it. Well, one thing you can do is use a pair of crimp lug pliers like this. Now this has got little semicircular indents here, and that works quite well. It's not as good as what I normally use, but this one would certainly work. The problem is the rewind button doesn't stick up much, so you're only getting a grip on a very small area there. What I tend to use instead is this. This is a pair of pliers that I've modified. Basically it was a cheap set of pliers, which was good because it means the steel's probably not very hard. Cut the end off with a grinder, probably, either a grinder or a Dremel. Stick it in the vise like that. Centre popped in between the jaws. Ran a small pilot drill down there. Then ran a drill bit down there of appropriate diameter to match that button. Buffed it off on a buffing wheel to take the sharp edges away, and that works very well. So in use, all I can do is hold my thumb on the sprocket, use my pliers to grab that button, and it breaks away fairly easily. And so I've got my nicely chromed button in a good order, and the spring I'll pop to one side. I'll close the front of the camera. Now at this stage I notice this little washer. That's the spacer washer from the shutter release that I mentioned earlier. It's now decided that it's an appropriate time for that to fall out. That's okay. We'll let it. Now I want to get this leather back here so you can see I can get my scalpel in at a more useful angle now instead of poking it much more vertical. And I want to get this leather peeled back. Now this is glued quite well. The leather is in good condition. And I just work backwards and forwards from one side to the other and use the edge of the camera body there as a guide to my scalpel blade as I slide it in like this. Try and avoid cutting anywhere near that top surface, otherwise you'll certainly mark that aluminium. It's fairly soft. You can do a very thorough job of scarring it for life if you let your scalpel slide over the top of it. Okay. Well, that's probably far enough. What it means is that any mark will be right down here near that boss, any mark that you see after I glue everything back, and it'll be completely hidden really. Oh, let's carry on here. The return spring for the rewind button catch, I'll just undo that. Remove the screw. The screw is a stepped shoulder screw. Recover that spring and recover the catch. While we're in here, our film advance shaft, there are 3 screws hold the bush on the shaft to the camera body. Just recover those. All these pieces I'm just putting in a container because these pieces are going to go into the ultrasonic cleaner. Alright, I can open that, tip out my take-up spool, which is plastic. That gets put to one side. Then there is a spacer collar underneath, which is metal. That goes through the cleaner. My sprocket shaft here, we have a screw here that couples the sprocket shaft and the sprocket together, and I can push up that shaft from below and remove that, and there's our sprocket. I'll pop that to one side. The sprocket typically doesn't need to go anywhere near the cleaner. If it's dirty, I'll clean that with a bit of naphtha manually, but usually it's not. The camera body is now fairly well stripped down. I'm going to remove the lens and shutter assembly from the camera and then start dismantling the rest of it. You need a special spanner really to remove the lens and shutter assembly from these retinas, and it's because the retainer ring is down deep in the well. There's virtually no space between the lens and the shutter body, the lens mount, in order to get a tool in there, so something like this is usually required. This was a Beljan tool from the USA, but Mr. Beljan no longer makes them as far as I'm aware. I do have dimensions available on my website as a guide to making a tool of a similar nature. So I'll just pop that in there. Oh, that retaining ring was in tight. The tool has to be cut away like that on the side so that it'll actually fit through the film gate. And there's our lens and shutter assembly separated from the camera. I'll pop that to one side. The retaining ring, I'll just remove that now. It's loose in there. And start disassembling all this stuff. I'm going to start by taking the door off. We have a screw that forms the hinge pin top and bottom for the door, and this one is probably no looser than most, and one at the top. Now there may be one or more shim washers between the door and the camera body to take up any play. There's one of them. And there's another one. They're not always present, but sometimes they are. There's another one again. Can't pick that damn thing up. That's anything that's magnetised. Yes. Okay, so I think I got all of those. Right, taking the door off the front of this here. If I stretch the door upwards, I can unhook that. Now there's two cartridge paper washers. I'll put those carefully to one side. They'll want to go back on. They're in good order. They're a bugger to cut, tiny washers like that. It's very hard to make a neat job of that process. Our focus mount here, well, this, as you can see, is very, very dirty and sticky, very hard to shift. That's not at all uncommon, of course. I'm going to remove the two screws here that hold this ring on the front. This ring on the front has an arm attached to it, and the arm here has a screw boss at the top, and that screw boss moves our rangefinder in and out. as the focus moves. So we can take that arm off, and I'll put that to one side. Our focus scale ring. Well, I need to note the point at which the focus scale ring, the shiny chrome part, and the shiny brass part here, the outer helical, I need to make note of where they fit relative to each other so I can ensure that it goes back in the same place. So normally I scribe a couple of lines across it at the bottom, and I usually put 2 lines at the bottom and 1 at the top, because then I can be sure of exactly where it goes back. Now, I haven't done anything about lining up the inner and outer helical there. I've only just made my lines across the focus scale ring and the outer helical. We also need to know how the inner and outer helical are organised relative to each other. We can take that off. 4 black screws here hold the bellows to the back of the front standard, so we can take those out. And the bellows should just fall back into the camera body here, they've just separated. These 4 larger screws here hold the focus mount into the front standard. And I can slide this focus mount out. So I'll reclaim those screws. Let's look at the focus mount. There are 6 nickel plated screws hold the retaining ring in place. The retaining ring in turn holds the outer helical into the focus mount. These 6 screws are basically the same as the 4 screws that held the focus scale ring in place. And if the screws on the focus scale ring were damaged because the focus scale ring had been pulled loose as a result of the focus being overly stiff, then you can swap the screws around so you have your 4 best screws holding the focus scale ring in place, and you can get away with uglier screws here. Right, so we'll just separate the focus helical from the mount. This will have to be cleaned by hand because it's got paint and a felt washer on the back. Now here I'm interested in making sure I know the correct alignment for these. What I do is I twist the inner and outer relative to each other until I've got the front surfaces level, and then I will extend my scratch marks that I put in here across. It's those 2 at the base I'm concerned with. And the one at the top, I see I've already marked that, and that's which I shouldn't have done. I shouldn't have gone across there, but I did. Okay, so the front surfaces are level, and I've got continued my marks across. So now I can put this back together in the right position. This is very stiff. The grease has really just gone to like glue, really. Right, so there's our loose parts. Carrying on with the camera body. 2 chrome plated brass screws hold this shroud on the front. Be careful with those screws. If you make a mess of them, I'll put the shroud to one side because otherwise I'll lose my nice pretty green markings if it went through the cleaner. Here's the gear on the front that cocks the shutter. That's the bush that it passes through, and the shaft here is this thing. It's coupled to this gear at the top, and it carries the action from the cocking rack to the shutter. Right, now we have 4 screws hold the struts into the camera body.